In about 18 months, not just me, but the team that had been brought in took that business from not having turned a profit in nearly a decade to a profitable business. It was a huge turning point for me, and it was driven from this idea of
what does it take to carve out a century-old company and win? Brian Melka did it. As the CEO of Rehlko, he reset culture for 9,000 people, built a business around energy resilience, and learned to make high-stakes calls with limited data. From a scrappy childhood in rural Iowa to transforming global operations, Brian shares hard truth on culture, decision quality, and leading when everything is on the line. So, ready? Let's dive in.
What has been your major focus since you became a CEO?
at Harvard about a year ago, and it was 50 or 60 private equity-backed CEOs. And this topic of culture came up, and they said, we don't have time for that. And I was one of the few people in the room that actually raised her hand and said, wait a minute, I think you can't not spend time on it. I think you gotta get it reset. Walk around like you own the place. Don't walk around like you own the place from an arrogant standpoint. Walk around like your decisions that you're making are that important. I like opposing viewpoints. If everybody's aligned on a decision, sometimes I'm questioning, there's something wrong here. What are we missing?
So when you are on your table and you say, that's going to be one of those decisions I have to make, and you don't have the perfect data, you don't have all the insights, which happen 99.9% of the time, how do you deal with such a big decisions that need to be made?
One of the things that one of my mentors, Ryan Weeks, who's become a great friend of mine, was my mentor at the time, he said,
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to a new episode of the World Class Leader Show. And in today's episode, I'm very, very excited to have with me Brian Melka. Brian is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Rehlko, a role that he was appointed to in May 2024. Brian was named Group President, Power for Kohler Company in May 2020 after serving in various leadership roles, including President for Kohler Engines since 2013. Brian has a history of transformation, having joined Kohler as Vice President for Kohler Engines Americas, where he and his team delivered the best run of profitable growth in the history of the engines business. More recently, Brian guided the power business through its transformation and growth to become Kohler Energy and ultimately in the successful carve-out of the business from Kohler into a standalone entity and industry leader in resilient energy solutions. So with more than 25 years of experience in transforming industrial companies, he brings a passion for winning and building high-performing teams that overcome the most difficult challenges. So prior to Kohler, he held senior leadership roles with Rexnord and Textron. Brian is a board member, a past board chair of the Outdoor Power Equipment Institute, and advisory board member of M-Cubed, an educational collaboration between Milwaukee Public Schools, Milwaukee Area Technical College, and University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. A graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Brian holds a bachelor's degree in finance and investor banking, earning an MBA from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and holds international business certification from Thunderbird School of Global Management, and he also certified Six Sigma Master Black Belt. Brian, welcome to the show.
thank you for having me.
I've been in a construction world, although primarily from an energy standpoint for many, many years. So I definitely understand the challenges, but also the great opportunities. But before getting into, what is happening in your company and what you're up for, one thing that you shared before while we were stepping into the studio was your origin. I'm always interested to hear how CEOs became CEOs. So it's one of the questions many people have in the audience, either because they're ambitious leader, they want to understand it. How can I get there myself? And do I need to be the best MBA graduate? Do I need to get university from an Ivy school? Do I need to have a typical career progression? But your story, the beginning of your story, tells us something very different, isn't it?
I don't think CEOs are born. I think they're created along a journey that starts, for me at least, started very early in my life. I grew up and was born in a small town in Iowa, a rural part of the United States, in a farming community. Very poor, relatively speaking, grew up that way. In my family, we didn't know that there was a such thing as electricians or plumbers or auto mechanics. In our family, that was just dad. My dad did everything and my mom did everything. And it was just the way, my brothers and I were brought up, which was if you needed something done, you needed to take care of it. You needed to have a high level of accountability. You needed to be able to execute and get things done. And of course, when I was a kid, I didn't know that. I didn't know what I was experiencing. But when I look back on it now, I realized that that kind of scrappiness was something that was a key development for me that has carried me through the rest of my life, that I learned from my parents and I learned from the community I grew up in, and I don't think that made me the CEO, but it put me on a path to you gotta learn how to do a lot of different things. You know, as CEOs, we wear many hats. We're often the decision makers on so many complex topics, but we also had to rely on each other. You know, that was also a part of the family, which was you have to have a team around you to execute and get things done. So you had to rely on others to do that, and then you had to be scrappy. You had to be tenacious. You had to be resilient and find ways to accomplish.
Would you ever imagine at that time that you could potentially lead a global or large company?
I think at the time I was just trying to save up some money to buy my next bike. You know, there wasn't anything in my mind that thought I was going to be there, but I did know, I think very early on that any journey that I was going to have in my career was not going to be necessarily in a straight line. And I think there's a lot of belief that leaders, you know, like you said, and kind of when you opened up is you go to the right school, you get the right first job, you work for the right companies, and you will kind of miraculously just end up in the top job. And that may have been true at some point in time, but it certainly isn't true anymore. And it certainly wasn't true for me. And so I wasn't thinking that way, but I was thinking about how do I learn? You know, every step of the way, how do I learn something new? How do I apply that? How do I solve problems? And I think that's career foundation was not only built on those challenging times when I was younger and looking at how my family dealt with those issues, but also recognizing that every challenge became an opportunity to learn and do something new and carried me through.
That's such a great attitude. And by the way, I think that is a very positive and news, or at least insight from people. They are too much concerned of being CEO. To become a CEO, if you have that level of ambition, you're required to meet some specific standards or criteria along the way, which you essentially are disrupting that thinking, given you can become a CEO from and taking a very different path than what could be considered as a traditional path to get there. So positive news for those people that are ambitious.
And I often advise young people, careers are often not built in straight lines. And the best opportunities that you have will be those ones where it's not even a promotion. It's just about going to do something different and to learn something new and to round yourself out. And those are the best learning opportunities that you'll ever have. And it's not, I mean, my background will show you, I've been in Six Sigma, I've been in HR, I've worked in the finance field, I've dabbled in IT, not very well. Um, and I've been in mostly manufacturing and heavy industrial businesses. So that's probably the common theme through my career. But it was never, take this job and that's going to get me that job and that job's going to get me that job. It was more, my career was built on, running to where the challenges were and being somebody who saw problems and with my background, how can I help solve that problem and execute?
Your early definition of scrappy, I think it sounds like it's a good way of, describing what you've been through than a traditional, straight line career. But even myself, I remember in my senior career, I had a couple of moments. Those moments when you have some sort of, for me, it was kind of a reinvention. So I was really succeeding, and then something happened, and I feel like, oh, am I failing now? And that led me to a very important self reflection in terms of how I was showing up and the way I was working, the way I was, most importantly, I was leading and I was dealing with myself, my own thoughts and way of being. So, do you have any sort of pivotal moment or turning point in your career inside all this crappy, history that you had? There's something that you might remember as that's gonna be a turning point for me. That changed something for me.
Probably especially early on, was the biggest turning point was in the early 2000s. I was working for Textron at the time, big multi-industrial global company. And there was a business unit that was struggling, and it was an operating unit that I don't think it had, turned a profit in nearly a decade, was changing over the leadership team. And two former colleagues of mine were going into that business and they said, come here, come work with us. Now, the reality is nobody wanted to go work in this business. I mean, it just hadn't turned a profit in a long time. It was in a tough industry, but I saw a big opportunity to make an impact and to learn something and do something new.
People might say, no, that is still risky. So there's nothing to win here.
Oh yeah, that's fear. Yeah, that's risky. It's way too risky. Absolutely. So it was just a great opportunity to go do that. And one of the things that one of my mentors, Ryan Weeks, who's become a great friend of mine, was my mentor at the time. He said, walk around like you own the place when I first got there. And I thought, well, that sounds arrogant. And what he meant was don't walk around like you own the place from an arrogant standpoint. Walk around like your decisions that you're making are that important, that you are, in fact, an owner of this company. And what would you do if you owned it? And you have to make decisions. This was a turnaround business. This was clearly a turnaround business. This was 100 hours a week, not seeing my family for long periods of time, traveling, but it was really about you had to make decisions, you had to make them fast. You knew that more than half of your decisions were probably gonna be wrong, but you had to pivot and change direction, make another decision, change direction. Just like anybody who does own a business, you really have to think like that. And it was a real challenging time. It was a lot of hours. It was a lot of problems to solve. It was a lot of problems that had lingered for decades. And in about 18 months, not just me, but the team and some of the other leadership team that had been brought in, took that business from not having turned a profit in nearly a decade to a profitable business. But it was a huge turning point for me, and it was driven from this idea of you've gotta make decisions, you have to be accountable. You're accountable, and you have to make decisions, and people are counting on you to do that.
We can stay 30 minutes just on that point because one thing that from my experience of working in a number of organizations, what is often missing is a mindset of ownership, which to me it's slightly different than accountability. Meaning accountability is more in terms of assigning roles, responsibility, and feeling, and people doing more tactically to some extent. While the real ownership is a mental shift when you feel like you own it, either the problem or a challenge or whatever you are confronting to, regardless what is going to be your role and responsibility, because you feel like you can do something about it. So to me, that is such a great point in terms of ownership. So well done. I'm sure that has been one of the key reasons why you've been successful.
There's really 3 key themes that work for me, and I would say they don't necessarily work for everybody. You have to find your own, personal identity, call it personal brand. There was an article that came out in 1999 in Fast Company magazine, and it was all about Gen X and the me generation, which I'm a Gen Xer, and it was about creating your brand, and accountability was one of those key things, and that's owning it, being accountable to your team being accountable to you. Like, that sense of ownership's really important. The reality is you can be great anywhere. And if you're gonna be great anywhere, why not be great here? But that starts with you have to believe you can be great. You have to believe that your team can be great, and then you have to own it and be accountable to it.
If you remember, I'm sure you do, given that it's been a pivotal moment for you. If you go back in time and think about you, how you were showing up at the time, and I'm sure for many people are dealing with crisis, turnaround, so critical moments for their organizations. One of the typical reaction of people is starting to entertain their own inner voice that potentially says something like, "Oh, I'm not able to do it. Oh, is it is really difficult, or am I going to survive here?" All the typical things that happen in our mind that normally drive our own action, even unwittingly. Did you feel any time that you were confronting, yourself during moment of, difficulties, stress, and pressure? How did you deal with that at that time?
All the time. I mean, I think that's the reality. I don't think if there's not in these high pressure roles, at different layers of the organization, if you're not feeling some of that intensity and pressure, you may not be pushing it hard enough, and I think that's one of the realities of that. And that's what comes with having a winning mentality. If you're always striving to be better. And even when things go great, it's how do you make them even better the next day? And dealing with that comes down to what can you control? And one of the things I talk about a lot is there are a lot of influencing factors. We're in the energy industry. There's so much that is dependent on regulation, on weather events, on competitive pressures. But the reality is you can only control the things that you can control. And I take a lot from kind of the sports world of American football, that you've got a best plan on paper, but as soon as the ball is hiked, somebody's punching you in the face. You literally have to react in that situation and then control what you could control. And the rest of it's noise. And I think that's how you navigate through the most challenging times is you can't control everything. You can't fix everything. But what you can do is get after the most important, highest priority things and the things that you can control and execute to your best ability.
And if I can add one thing to your point, I think is not even become victim of circumstances, like start, blaming the external factors and whatever condition you are in, because that doesn't give you access to anything from a leadership standpoint. So back to the present. So tell us more about your company now.
So Rehlko is actually a 100-plus-year-old company. We focus on energy resilience. In fact, that's our entire purpose, is creating an energy resilient world for a better future. But it didn't start as Rehlko. It started as part of Kohler. Kohler is a 150-year-old American company, family-owned, multi-generation business. And a few years ago, we started the process of carving the business out. Our what we called the power group at the time had become, frankly, kind of different, large, big part of the portfolio, needed a different operating structure. And so about 18 months ago, we carved out the business from Kohler. And so we're a standalone company today. That's when I became CEO. Yeah, so but I had been in the role, as a group president, but it is a different role. It's a different role from being kind of the number 2 operating leader inside of a company to being the leader, inside the company. So we carved out the business 18 months ago, into a standalone basis, and what we do is we provide, like I said, energy resilience. Our biggest category is we provide backup generator systems for everything from homes to schools to hospitals, to data centers, and data centers is one of our fastest growing businesses. We've been doing it longer than anybody else. There's big names out there. We have great competitors, and we've been doing it longer than anyone else in the industry.
Yeah, and from my experience in the energy market, I came across Kohler multiple times. So at least you're aware. I was possibly one of your clients at the time and back in my corporate career. And what has been your major focus since you became a CEO? I mean, given that was the first time for you, at least operating as a first leader, I appreciate what you said. Even if you're a president or group president, that doesn't yet really translate into being the CEO. What did you notice as a major difference first, and what was your main focus, besides the traditional like improving numbers, all of that?
And people overlook this, especially in a massive change environment, is we had to reset the culture. At the end of the day, that 9,000 people in the organization, they're looking to me and the top leadership team every day for guidance and direction through a very tumultuous time. And carving out a business that's been closely held for over 100 years is just change on every level. And in any way you think about it, from process to brand to the product categories and everything we have in between, what we had to do is really reset the culture and really shape our own culture. And we took that from, kind of a blended cultural view of what that was like under a kind of multi-industrial company to a one that's singularly focused on energy resilience. And the reason to do that wasn't necessarily about we weren't going to get people to change their behavior on day one, but it gave them a direction and where we were headed and also how we were intending for people to act while we were going there. And if you don't get that foundationally right, then all the other activities are gonna be questioned, they're gonna be challenged. You're always gonna have this internal bias towards against change. And so the first and foremost thing was we had to get the purpose right. We had to get the cultural norms right. Then we applied the actions. Now, the biggest actions we took was we created our own, what we call our value creation plan. We knew that we had a business that was not performing up to the expectations or capabilities. We benchmarked the competitors in the market. And that's one of the things I always do is I look at not internally, like, are we doing better than we did last year or the year before? That's an easy one to measure, but it gives you a kind of a blinded view on what's really going on in the world. We really looked at where do we compete on a bunch of financial and operational performance metrics relative to our broad competitor set in the market, and we reset our expectations of what performance looked like. Now, once we did that, then we engaged the top leadership team, which is roughly 100 people across the enterprise, to say, okay, now how are we going to go do that? And so it was getting people set on the direction that we're headed, the behaviors and expectations of how we're going to build the culture going forward, the aspirational goals that we had from a business performance standpoint, and then letting the people that are accountable, that have the capability, the knowledge, the experience to be able to go execute it, then build the plans to go execute. I didn't build the plan. I built the framework and allowed the team to really do that. And I think to get through this massive transition, it also kept people somewhat distracted because they were focused on, well, where are we going? And they weren't looking in the rearview mirror on where we came from. They were looking at where we're going forward. And it really helped accelerate people through that change, I think.
I'm sure that's exactly what was needed. How do you find the challenge that many leaders have in mobilizing people toward a new vision, new way of working, new way of operating, based on what I think you call it as a reset? How are you finding this? Given one of them, by the way, it's interesting that many CEOs that are coming on the show, when we ask them what is the top of mind for you in your agenda, you might not be surprised, but 90% of them say it's culture. It's changing the culture of my organization, or at least shaping the culture to provide a different level of results. So you are in the system. But hey, it's easy to say, it's more difficult to do it because culture is not, doesn't, at least in my experience, it doesn't work as a process. It doesn't work as a plan. That's the new culture. So embrace the new behaviors, just do it, right? It doesn't work because we are dealing, whether we like it or not, with human beings and with all the flaws that we have in terms of following a new path. How do you find mobilizing people towards something new, especially in a kind of a very, I don't want to look like judgmental old style, but it sounds like a company that comes with a heritage, with a history. And that's not easy making a change because people they are much more used to do work in a traditional way.
It's interesting that you say that about other people that you talk to. I was at an event at Harvard about a year ago, and it was 50 or 60 private equity backed CEOs, and our company's private equity backed. And this topic of culture came up, and the the overwhelming response into the room from most of these CEOs was, "I don't have time for that." PE is on a different pace. Everything's got to move faster. Investors want returns faster. And they said, we don't have time for that. We got to get the financial results and we got to go. And I was one of the few people in the room that actually raised their hand and said, wait a minute. I think you can't not spend time on it. Like, I think you've got to get it reset. But I don't think culture is something you change overnight. We built call it our cultural norms, and we have 4 very simple kind of sayings that we say: curiosity, trust, pace, and excellence. That's how we want leaders to act. That's how we want team members to act. They're simple words. They have definitions, but frankly, they can be defined how you want them defined as an individual. But we also knew that some of those were things that we already do today. We think we have a high level of trust with our customers, our
So
suppliers, our
it was
team
grounded
members.
in this is
And
how
some of
we
those are
are, but also
aspirational.
how we
The
want
idea
it
of
in the
excellence and the
future.
idea that you
And
can
in
win
some
every
cases,
single
that
day
whole
is
slate is never
aspirational.
going to get
So
you
it was
where you
grounded
see.
in
It's
this is
always
how
going to
we
be just a
are,
little
but
bit
also
further
how we
away.
want
Yeah.
to be in the
And I think
future.
that's how
And in
you
some
engage people.
cases,
You get them
that whole
excited
slate of
about.
is
I can
never going to
see
be
how that
achieved. Like
applies to me today.
it's always going to
I
be
can
just a
also
little bit
see
further
how I could
away.
aspire.
And I think that's how you engage people. You get them excited about, I can see how that applies to me today. I can also see how I can aspire to that in the future. And it gives them some momentum, and I think that's how we engage it. Now, the reality is, I don't know if it's roughly a third or a third or a third, but you're going to have a third of the people that are going to just jump on board immediately with change. They love it. They embrace it. They run towards it. You're going to have a bottom third who say, I don't care what the change is. No matter what you do, I don't like it. And you've got that middle group that can go one way or the other. And that's the group that you actually have to focus on because you're never going to get the bottom group. You're never going to get them. And frankly, you might need to make some changes and you might need to help them be happier, frankly, somewhere else. That's the way I think about it is they're not a good fit for this culture going forward. They're not going to be happy. We're not going to be happy. So how do we make it easy for them to go find, what they're passionate about somewhere else? It is definitely that middle group that you've got to get swell over the line into the excited group, and that's the group you have to focus on. It's easy to get excited about the ones that are jumping up and down at change, and then get that group in the middle that you really need to move forward. But it starts with you can't have some cultural goal or expectation that's completely unachievable. So there's got to be some grounding in, we already exhibit a lot of these behaviors today, and then add some aspirational piece to it that's still I can still achieve more.
Having aspirational values or behaviors keep people also, I think, in a quest for improving, stay ambitious, and keep improving, and and going to the next level in their journey. By the way, the rule of third. it works. So is it? I don't know who came with that, but it's quite consistent. I mean, what I see in organizations is exactly that. Take it or leave, but that's more or less about the rule of thirds.
And I don't think we did, and I say we because it was a team effort, right? Obviously, I was setting the pace and guiding the direction, but I had a lot of help and coaching to some respects to my leadership team. I don't think we did something that was miraculous in that way, but it was intentional. And I think as CEOs, it's one of the biggest changes too, is that everything you do going forward, everyone is looking at. Everyone is watching every meeting you're in, every email that gets sent out, every decision you make, it has to be with intention. And we set out very, very early, actually before we even started the carve out of the business from Kohler, we were very intentional about setting what our purpose and our culture was going to look like so that as we were going through that change, we were layering in it at the same time. We weren't playing catch up, but it was all about being intentional and just, modeling some of the behaviors we'd seen be successful, but then being very, very focused on executing it at the right time.
As I always say to leaders, people, whether you like it or not, they're watching you every single step all the time. The word that you use, the email that you send or you don't send, the action you take or you don't take. So you are always under the microscope.
I learned that the hard way, to be honest with you. I was in a meeting. This was before I was CEO. This is 10 years ago. I was a senior leader, though, and I was not on my best behavior in a meeting, and I think we all have those days, and we kind of want to pull them back. Was not on my best behavior. Probably didn't use the right language that I should have used in a meeting with about 10 or 20 people. And within an hour, somebody was standing in my office saying, "Hey, we heard what you said in this meeting." And I thought, that was an eye opener for me that it's not only they're watching you, they're telling others. Right? And so you're always everything you do again has to be with intention. It has to be meaningful and just recognize that you're going to make mistakes. It's not about never making a mistake, but people are going to see it. And they're going to take their cues from you and how you lead and how you act and how you behave. And that perception as a CEO is also the perception of your company, which I think is the other big piece of it, is that you are so connected with your brand and your company that your leadership perception becomes a big part of the overall perception of the business.
Talking about you and your leadership, what did you change, if anything, when you became a CEO? Meaning, did the role provide you or offer new insight in terms of how you needed to show up as a leader compared to previous experiences?
I think the biggest thing was, we talked about this offline, is there's nobody there standing there next to you to tell you how to do your job. And you can get overwhelmed because I went from being a large leader in an organization or of a large organization, but inside of another organization, there was boundaries in terms of decisions that need to get made, and they got elevated to the CEO at that point or other areas. Now all of a sudden they're all on your desk. And the single biggest change that you have to make, or at least I had to make, was what I call decision quality, is understanding what decisions you have to make because you're the only person in the organization that can really make these decisions. And what decisions kind of at the other end of the spectrum that you just want to delegate because even if they make a wrong decision, it's not that risky to the organization. So it's kind of a quality risk understanding because if you try to make all the decisions, you'll just get overwhelmed. Everything will flow to you. And if you try to make none of the decisions, well, you're just not going to be effective as an organization. So it's a really tough balance of understanding kind of the quality and the risk of understanding what decisions do you have to make because you're the only ones that can do it. Where do you delegate and become more of the decision process? And where do you just say, look, that's a decision you make. Even if you make the wrong one, it's okay. It's a learning opportunity.
But how do you deal with such a big decisions that need to be made? So when you are, on your table and you say, there's going to be one of those decisions I have to make, and you don't have the perfect data, you don't have all the insights, which happen 99.9% of the time. Even getting to 90% would be great, right? How do you deal there? I'm asking because that is one of the most interesting part, in my opinion, of being a CEO. Making tough decision on your own, even if you're get suggestion, advice from people around you. But at the end of the day, as you say, it's your decision. It's your responsibility.
And there's certainly in our company, just like anybody, there's certain governance rules that require me to take certain things to the board or not. And so, outside of that, I think, I've always believed in a data-driven decisions is very important, and I would tell people, if you don't have data, then my opinion is the only one that matters. So bring data because that's always helpful. But I also believe there's an 80% and go philosophy, which is at some point you have to make a decision based on the best available information you've got. And in that situation, when I'm trying to decide the right direction, the first thing I will ask is, assuming I have enough information, I'll ask, what is the best thing to do for our customer? That's always the first question. And and the second question is, what is the most important thing to do for our team? And sometimes those are 1A and 1B, but they're very clearly like, what is the best thing to move the company forward? The last is, what's the best for our investors? And they may not want to hear that, but I feel like if I can make the customer more successful, I can make the team more successful, then at the end of the day, the investors will be happy. So that becomes the tiebreaker is if we've got a big decision, it's what is the best thing for that for the customer? That usually becomes the number one tiebreaker in making the final decision. And then, I obviously that decision process is not only taking data, but inputs from the team and inputs from various viewpoints. I like opposing viewpoints. If everybody's aligned on a decision, sometimes I'm questioning, there's something wrong here. What are we missing? So I like that, but at the end of the day, it comes down to if we don't have perfect information, which you never will, what's the best thing to do for our customer?
One thing that you shared as well, which is very familiar to my world, is as a CEO, you are struggling all the time with managing your own time and your calendar agenda. And I know you have a competing priorities. Everybody wants to talk to the CEO. Everyone wants to have the attention of the CEO. And that I know has a deep impact on CEOs. It's not just about their own time, managing their own time and whatever comes with it, but also sometimes, unfortunately, say no to people and giving constraints. How do you deal as CEO with one of the most challenging resources that you have available, which is your time?
It's the most critical resource. It's the other area that, if you asked me, was the kind of biggest challenge in moving into this role was time management. And often that goes hand in hand with what decisions you're making, but it's around time management. And I would say inherently, I'm a yes person, meaning you wanna meet with me, you wanna talk about I love every level of the business. I love to get out on the shop floor. I love to solve the simplest problems with the team if I can, and so I love to be kinda in the weeds and not micromanage, probably at times I do step over that line, but I just love being part of it. But that also there's just no way you can do that. There's just no way you can spend the amount of time. And so I actually have to deploy a third party resource. And so I have an executive assistant and I also have a communications leader. Between the two of them, they basically manage my time for me in probably not 100%, but probably 80% of what I do. Because if I don't have that screen, I will say yes to everything. And I learned very, very quickly that I wasn't going to be able to do it myself. And, I have an amazing executive assistant who I told her, your number one job is to manage my time because the company, my team members, my customers, they pay us a lot to do this job. Rewarded and we're thankful and I'm, gracious to have it, but I can't do it effectively if I'm, working on things that I shouldn't be working on, or I'm spending too much time and it's deteriorating my health or my personal life. And so I'll admit my approach to it is I outsourced it. That's basically what I did.
So we discussed about changing culture, or at least shaping a new culture for driving development performance. We discussed about making tough decisions, how to approach them. We discussed about managing time as one of the other bigger challenges. What other challenges people they don't necessarily are aware of in terms of what the CEO is dealing with every single day?
Yeah, I think what you go from if you're an operating leader in a business, even a large business, to being the CEO, is that working on the business is roughly only, half of your time or less. And we talk about time management, decision making, but just even how you allocate that because of the pressures and pull on you. You go from being I was a group president, I spent 100% of my time working on the business and with the people in the business and with customers and suppliers. As CEO, you only spend about 50% of your time doing that because the rest of the time you're talking to your lenders, you're talking to your board, you might be doing analyst calls, depending on how your corporate structure is, but you spend as much time on that as you do actually working on the business. And that is a big change. And also, there, by the way, there's no playbook. Nobody handed me a playbook on the day one and said, "Oh, by the way, your time is now going to be spent on these analyst calls and meeting with the board. How much time you spend on the board, how much time you spend with your chairperson or your various committees, your audit committee, and all the things that you didn't necessarily even realize existed in some cases when you were at a level down in the organization. They consume a lot of time, and they're important. You know, they're not things that you can delegate. You have to do that, which means the other stuff you do have to delegate, and you have to have an amazing team. And that's, I talked about accountability before. I've talked about a passion for winning. The third element of my leadership is about building great teams. It's one of the things I learned, very early on in my experience. While you can do a lot yourself, you can't do it all. And the bigger that gets, and the more complex that gets, the more challenging that gets, the more you have to have an amazing team, and you have to be able to count on them for their expertise and their leadership capability, because you're going to spend 50% of your time doing things that don't seem like they're working on the business. And it's very counterintuitive to an operator, or you're being left out of things you were in before that you really liked doing, but you can't just like doing them, if they're not actually helping the business move forward. So
So one thing I'm curious is we had a number of CEOs, primarily those people that are much more at the end of their career, or they retire, maybe they're working now as a board member, advisor, etc. One thing on a reflection back, what they said, not everybody, but some of them, is unfortunately impact that being a CEO has on your personal life. Meaning, I think we have to break this sort of things that people have in mind, like CEOs living a wonderful life of traveling all over the world, going to the press conference, to the ballroom, to events. I know it's a part of the role, but from my personal experience, personal as a CEO, but also working with a lot of CEOs, the reality tells you a completely different story. CEOs are busy and doing their best to make things happen. And that has an impact on personal life. It's not like having such a fun, great time and smiling to everybody and then enjoying, a lot of things that other people they can't. Would you say that has something that you are aware of, the impact of your role at personal level?
I think without a doubt, today, by the way, I'm very humbled to be with you. So thank you for inviting me. And I was very glad to be accepting of the invitation to be here. I flew into London from Chicago this morning. I got here at 9 a.m. This is my fifth meeting today. I've got two more yet today. So I'll be in three hotels in the next 3 nights. That is what the life is like. It's not as glamorous. And I'm not asking for pity, but it's not as glamorous as some think. But in terms of the personal life, it absolutely, you have to manage that like you do everything else in your work. I often tell people, you talk about work-life balance. There is no work-life balance. There's just your life, and work is part of that. But you have to be as structured around, at least for me, around the way you focus with your family and your personal relationships outside of your family and work as you are on your work environment. And I think that's the only way to approach it for me, is the same kind of intention and the same kind of focus, is making sure that I'm present with my family, making sure that I'm, spending time with my kids as they're growing up. My youngest son is in high school. He's about to move on here in the next year or two. But you have to focus on it with almost the same rigor and discipline. It seems sterile. That's not the way I mean it to sound it, but you have to make sure that you're intentional about spending time with your family and your personal interests outside of that, and take care of your health. I think there's too many people that think, I'll take care of my health later, while they're burning the midnight oil, while they're spending, 3 days in three hotels, and you've got to take care of your health. So for me, I wish I ate better. I don't eat as good as I would like, but I don't miss a workout every single day. And so you have to structure it, you have to schedule it just like you do your work life. And there's really no difference in the way you approach it. At least for me, that's what's worked.
So final question is there any other thing as an advice you like to give to those people that are listening today and they have the ambitions to become a CEO? What would you say could be one thing they need to consider beyond what you already shared, of course, in terms of attitude, leadership? But what would you suggest them to consider?
I think the biggest thing is run to the places that others won't go. I think the ability to learn and experience new things and solve problems, it's kind of run to the fire mentality, I think has been the single biggest kind of common theme for me throughout my childhood, my schools, my career has been go take on the challenges others won't. And don't focus so much on this straight line mentality of I'm going to take this job and this one is go to the challenges that seem the hardest and that others don't want to do because you will have the opportunity to learn and do new things.
And on that, you're growing outside of your comfort zone, but also you get noticed. You get noticed, your visibility in organization.
You can't just run to the fire and then run away from it. But yeah, you have to execute and deliver. And yes, you'll get visibility, you'll get exposure. You also learn the process of problem solving. I think a big part of our careers, a big part of leading large companies is what problem do I have to solve today? And if you become adept and really skilled at problem solving with teams, you'll be very successful, very successful.
Brian, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been an amazing conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Great, and thank you everybody for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. To me, as always, it's been a lot of insights and advice, and I hope you can apply some of them in your work and be successful. So on that note, thank you so much for being on the show today. So please subscribe and leave a review, and see you in the next episode.